Welcome to everyone virtually joining us today for the fourth presentation in this academic year's ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. It's a privilege for me to welcome and introduce our speaker today, a former favorite professor of mine and now friend and colleague, Stefan Dolgert, PhD from Brock University, Department of Political Science. He will be presenting new material under the title Alien Athena, Reclaiming Our Posthuman Past. Stefan Dolgert is Associate Professor of Political Science at Brock University, where he writes and teaches on democratic theory, critical animal studies, posthumanism, hip-hop, and ancient Greek and classical Chinese political thought. He's currently a visiting professor at the University of Victoria and is finishing a manuscript on the rich tradition of non-anthropocentric thought in ancient Greece. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Dolgert.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you all for being here this morning, this afternoon, whatever time it is where you are. So I'm going to be sharing my screen in just a second, so I have a little PowerPoint that will walk us through my lecture today. I just want to say again, give thanks to the ASRI, to the University of Victoria, to the Departments of Political Science and English. I am actually physically out here in Victoria. We moved out here for the year. This is my research leave year. So I was hoping, initially to deliver this as an in-person lecture, but actually, hopefully, I'm able to speak to more of you this way than I would have otherwise were it in person. It's been amazing out here just being in Victoria. If you want to see evidence of this, you can go to my Twitter feed, which is @posthumanprof, and you can see that we filmed a seagull swallowing an eel whole out on the beach just by us just a couple of days ago. So these are the kind of post-human, more than human experiences that I've been experiencing here in Victoria. Okay, so let me get to my presentation here. So hopefully there you are all seeing my title slide, Alien Athena, Reclaiming Our Posthuman Past. One way, I guess, of introducing this lecture is to say this is part of a larger project. It's part of a book project. It's the book project that Taylor mentioned. The lecture is not going to presume that anyone has read the paper that was circulated. So I'm going to be talking about some of the things in the paper, but also trying to kind of bring a more general context and importance to what some of the specific matters in the paper. One way of thinking about what this talk is going to be about, or the way I'm going to be presenting this, is that I'm coming out of a kind of critical animal studies background, political science and critical animal studies. I'm very much concerned with challenging a number of the really terrible things that are going on in this time in the Anthropocene, animal agriculture, climate change, species die-off. I'm going to be doing this a couple of different ways. One is through science fiction and horror film. I'm going to be talking about the movie Alien, the 1979 horror film Alien. And to go to my next slide, I'm also going to be talking a little bit about twee Wes Anderson films. So this is the zone that I'm circling around here. So ending animal exploitation, science fiction, horror, and twee Wes Anderson films. So hopefully this is going to make some sense to you. So one way of thinking about this larger project then, in a kind of more humorous way, is through this quotation that I have here from Owen Wilson's character in The Royal Tenenbaums, who is a professor, and he's a pretty shallow guy. He publishes a novel about old Custer. As he's explaining this, he says, well, everyone knows Custer died at Little Bighorn. What this book presupposes is maybe he didn't. Well, the maybe he didn't is kind of what I want to pick up on here, that in a way, what I'm saying about our past and trying to talk about our past as a post-human past is to say Maybe the Greeks and our past and Western civilization is not the thing that we think it is. Maybe it's not anthropocentric at all. So that's one sort of more humorous way of thinking about this. A somewhat more serious way of entering into this imaginative space is through this quotation from Karl Marx and in his 18th Brumaire. So here Marx, I'm not going to read the whole quotation, but here Marx is pointing out that, and he's pointing this out as a problem, that people in these kind of revolutionary moments, instead of being able to create the world anew, they always go back into the past because in a way they're too anxious to create a new world. So they have to clothe the new things that they are doing in this in these past slogans, names, costumes, etc. So he thinks that this is a problem. I actually think that this is something that is it's useful, and it's also almost a kind of necessary process, that in order to actually create a new world, we almost always have to present that through this old language, through the things that are familiar to us. And so that's really what I'm trying to do here in this larger project, to say, for those people who think that the civilization that we're in is kind of irredeemable, and that especially some of these texts from the past, in particular the kind of canonical texts that have been put into Western civilization courses, so Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and there are many, many others, but specifically those are the folks that I'm going to be talking about today, that they are not, they're not in fact saying the anthropocentric things that we have been told that they are saying, and that in fact it's really helpful in terms of moving forward to be able to show to, you know, kind of the wider public, to say that we are in a civilization that is not irredeemably anthropocentric, and that our civilizational DNA is not anthropocentric at all. In fact, there is this really post-human or inhuman strand, and that's what I want to pull out and pick up on and accentuate in order to sort of pull us into a different kind of future. Okay, so for me, it's something like the way of the parasite for a post-human future. So what do I mean by that? I've talked about the challenge, what I see as the challenge of the present, right? This violent Anthropocene, which maybe better should be phrased as the Capitalocene, because it's not really just all humans at all points in time. It's really sort of specifically the rise of a kind of capitalist industrialized civilization that is really what is propelling us into really a potentially quite horrific future. The sixth great extinction, animal exploitation, animal agriculture, climate change. So our theorizing, our philosophizing really has a deadline, to put it in the terms of philosopher Nick Bostrom. We're really trying to head off some pretty terrible things from happening, and I see my work in the service of that much larger project. One approach, and the approach that I'm going to be suggesting to you today, is that we can take inspiration from non-human animals as a kind of method for how to help get ourselves out of this, or help at least challenge this what seems to be the civilizational impetus. So here's where I look to biomimesis. This is so, you know, something that is being used in all sorts of disciplines, but the idea of looking to biological, often non-human entities as exemplars to emulate in some way, so to imitate in some way. And so I'm going to be suggesting looking at some behavior of parasitic wasps as a kind of methodological inspiration for how to interpret texts from our, what I'm calling our civilizational DNA, in order to alter our future. So I have here in the second point, I say that, you know, this is thinking about animals not just as bearers of rights. I'm not going to be talking in any detail today about how animals should be considered, or not, how non-human animals should be brought into the polity as citizens, or however we might want to think of them. I'm not going to be specific about any of that. We could talk a little about that in the Q&A if you want. But I do take that as kind of one of my foundational assumptions, that I want us to include non-human animals in a much more citizen-like way as co-citizens, in whatever way that actually would get cashed out. So that's how I see this interpretive method being used, being purposed. So the question for me then is kind of how can we post-humanize our future via this biomimetic hacking of the past? And specifically for me, it's via using this, what I'm calling a parasitic interpretive method, to tease out these inhuman, ahuman, non-human, post-human strands from these Greek texts. So it's these three pieces that are kind of all working together for me: this challenge to the Anthropocene, this parasitism as an interpretive method, and then specifically the non-human aspects of these ancient Greek texts that I'm going to be getting to. And I'm just going to give you a taste of one specific text later on. That is Homer's Iliad. Okay, so here is just a brief glimpse at my heroine, my hero. This is Polycincta gutfreundi. This is one of the 80,000 species of ichneumoniid parasitic wasps. The Ichneumonidae are parasitic wasps. There are 80,000 different species of them. I'm not going to say too much more about the ichneumonids at this point. I will only note that, so these are wasps that basically lay eggs in spiders, and then the larvae grow inside the spider and then kill the spider and then come into being. The existence of the ichneumonids was so horrendous or so horrifying to Charles Darwin that he actually writes in a letter to a friend of his, and he says, "When I contemplate the existence of these parasitic wasps, I can't imagine that there is a beneficent God, a beneficent creator in this universe. That this is how terrible he thought the behavior of these wasps was." You know, this is again my Owen Wilson, Eli Cash. Well, what if they're not so bad? What if we can actually take something from their behavior to learn from? Okay, this image, to bring it back around now to the flyer, to the promotional literature that had an illustration connected to the movie Alien. This image comes from the 1979 Ridley Scott movie Alien, in which we have the behavior of an alien monster that is based in the actual behavior of parasitic wasps. So this is a fictionalized account that was quite literally generated from writers who observed what parasitic wasps do and then decided to make a movie in which the alien monster was basically doing what these parasitic wasps do, but doing it to human beings. So here is where what's called the face hugger, hence my little joke there about free hugs. This is the part of the alien creature called the face hugger that forcibly inserts a larva into a human being. And then the rest of the movie shows us the terrible things that happen when that little alien comes out. So let me just give you this image as a kind of, this is the snapshot for what I'm trying to do with the project as a whole. So let me explain what's going on in the movie, and then I'll make the connection to what I'm trying to do with the project. I guess I'll also say parenthetically that for those of you who are not maybe you're graduate students, this should give you some faith that you don't have to be particularly bright or clever in order to become a professor, because here you could see the absolutely amateurish way that I'm going about trying to illustrate this. So let my amateurishness be inspirational for those of you who who have more talent than I do. So in this snapshot here, we have the human Cain, who is the fellow who is writhing on the table. And if you've seen the movie, sorry, you will know what's happening here. He's writhing on the table because the parasite from the alien has been inserted into him, and it is about to explode through his chest, creating all sorts of gore, and then it will escape, and then it will grow into a very large monster later. What's interesting for me here, and what I want us to note, is if you look at the person who is on the right side of the screen that I have labeled as Western civilization or Western civ, I've got the circle around him. He seems to be a worried crew member. So this is a spaceship, the spaceship Nostromo, that has picked up this alien parasite. He seems to be quite upset about what's going on here. In fact, he's not. In fact, he, in a way, is the real antagonist in the film. He is a cyborg crew member who is actually following orders from the artificial intelligence that is running the ship. So it seems that what's going on in the story is there's an alien invader, that's the enemy. In fact, the kind of true opponent in this movie is the artificial intelligence and the ship that surrounds, and the kind of container in which all of these people are traveling. What seems to be an alien entity is actually colluding with the container that surrounds these individual humans in this spaceship. Let me just get that to the point then. The point for me is that I think that this can be instructive for thinking about how to sort of turn around our anthropocentric civilization. I think that we can, and again, so looking at the image, if you think about Cain, who is the victim in this case, but if you think about him as being anthropocentrism or the Anthropocene, anthropocentric civilization, what we can do is we can think about sort of placing a parasitic post-human into that anthropocentric civilization, and that in fact, this post-human parasite, which is, I think, going to be able to challenge and perhaps even turn anthropocentrism inside out, is not fundamentally an alien insertion. It is fundamentally connected with, again, to go to the image, to this this figure of Western civilization that we are all inside. So what I'm trying to say is we are all inside, in a sense, the texts that have been called Western civilization. And in fact, we can repurpose those texts. We can post-humanize those texts. And the texts themselves allow us to do this. There is nothing that says that Plato or Homer or Aristotle have to be these anthropocentric, rationalist speciesists. In fact, they can be quite other than that. All right, so this has been an overly long way of sort of taking us through the beginning. And again, apologies for some of the technical difficulties. This slide, I just wanted to show just as one sort of basic data point. I'm talking about making Athena, Athena, one of the chief goddesses of the ancient Greek world, sort of making Athena alien to us and drawing out the alien aspects of that ancient Greek civilization, the non-human or post-human aspects. I'm not just making this up whole cloth, and this is just one little, piece of evidence that we have these are probably not wasp goddesses, these are probably bee goddesses, but this was just one of the one way that the ancient Greeks were quite happy to view non-humans as godlike figures. These are not literally connected with Athena. For me, one of the reasons for thinking about the project and talking about it as Alien Athena is in part to riff on, as you see at the bottom of the slide, to riff on this classic work of Afrocentric classicist scholarship, revisionist classicism by Martin Bernal called Black Athena, which was in which he drew out the Afrocentric or the African roots of Western civilization. And so this is sort of an inspiration for me to draw out these post-human, non-human, alien aspects of supposedly, Western civilization via these texts of the ancient Greeks. Okay, so one response to this might be to say, well, do we really want to go back to the ancient Greeks? Don't we see the way that the ancient Greeks have been repurposed, especially by a kind of revitalized populist right? I did not make this image that you're seeing in front of you. This is, you can find all kinds of images like this. And in fact, at the recent riots in the Capitol, last week, you could see all kinds of ancient cosplay where essentially people were, playing as ancient Greeks or ancient Romans or ancient Vikings, or there were all kinds of different things they were cosplaying. So, one response you might have is, well, maybe going back to the Greeks is not such a great idea. I have to acknowledge, of course, that the ancient Greeks have been repurposed in this way. But of course, we can see all kinds of ways that this, what I'm calling the molon labe, that's the idea of come and take it, right? You can have my weapons when you come and take them from me, right? That's the saying that's attributed to the Spartans from the Battle of Thermopylae, which was just being depicted in part in that last slide. So, we know, for one thing, we know that there's all kinds of classical scholarship that says, well, no, of course, there are all sorts of other aspects to the ancient Greeks that are not this kind of virulent, toxic masculinity that we see in some of the kind of Spartacizing. We see that in some of the more popular works of Donna Zuckerberg and Rebecca Fudo Kennedy. So you can find their Twitter feeds, and you can see all kinds of really interesting scholarship that brings out all of these alternative aspects of classical civilization. So, this is Sparta and all of that, the slogan, this is Sparta, molon labe, it's a mythologized past, but so too is Western civilization. I don't have time today to go into this, but the whole idea of Western civilization and this idea of an kind of integral connection between the ancient Greeks and then sort of 17th, 18th, 19th century Europe, and then pulled into the present, is really a kind of construction of the late 1700s, especially German classical scholarship. So, Western civilization is an artifact of quite recent construction. Okay, so for me, and just to connect it back to that Marx quotation that I had mentioned at the beginning, I don't think this is necessarily a problem that we have in part a mythological relationship to the past. I think we are always ineluctably engaged in a kind of myth making with the past, in which we look back at the past to try to find ourselves in a sense, and we pull things from there because it's difficult to imagine creating ourselves anew in every moment. And so we look to the past, find really what we want to see in that past, and then claim that it's who we are in the present. So the mythologized past is an opportunity. It's not a problem. And I think we should try to be creative in terms of how we interpret that past. So for me, in thinking about how to create a kind of xenopolis, this is, my neologism, pulling together a couple of Greek terms, thinking about a city of aliens, a city of foreigners, where what has been seen to be foreign and strange and inhuman is brought together in some kind of community. To think about that future xenopolis, I think it's really useful to actually go back and pull on those strands in the past. Okay, so here is an illustration side by side of the activity or the results of the parasite that I've been talking about. So by the way, I know I have just about 15 minutes or 15 or 20 minutes in my lecture portion, so I'm probably going to have to speed through a little of this because of some of the interruptions. But just bear with me. So the image on the left is what we see the spider who is going to be parasitized by Polysphincta gutfreundii, the parasitic wasp, my heroine. This is what that spider normally does as a web. The image on the right is what the spider constructs once the parasite is inserted into the spider. So the spider actually creates a different kind of web because the spider begins to weigh, the spider has a different weight because there's another entity growing inside of it. And so it actually has to create a different kind of web in order to support itself. And it does this in part because the parasite from the wasp is neurochemically manipulating the spider to do that. So the parasite begins to hijack, it's not just inserted into the body, but it actually hijacks the brain or at least the neurochemical system of the spider in order to create a different kind of web so that that spider with the parasite doesn't just fall to the ground and isn't just eaten immediately, which would get rid of the parasite. So the parasite, in order to survive, has to get the spider to behave somewhat differently for a period of time until the parasite is able, the larva is able to actually grow and then come out of the spider. So here's how I think about what I'm calling Polysphincta gutfreundii's way as a kind of, and what I'm going to be applying as a kind of interpretive method in looking at the text that I want to look at. So 3 aspects: insertion, imitation, and rewiring. Insertion is, as the parasite, the larva, is inserted into the spider. For me, this is, I'm calling this the confession of weakness. The idea is that, look, we can't, it's very difficult to think about recreating the world as a whole. We're kind of weak individually. We are small, and we are trying to turn around something, what I'm thinking of as anthropocentric civilization. It's a big thing to turn around. So there's a kind of confession of weakness, which I think is useful, that the parasite is not trying to change everything all at once. It says, well, let me find this larger body to shelter myself in, but I'm going to try to turn that body around. I link this in other places to the work of Patricia Hill Collins, who talks about the neither inside nor outside, specifically in thinking about Black feminism. But I'll leave that. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A if someone wants to pick up on that strand. So the parasite inserts, then imitates. So it has to learn from the structure of the host. It has to understand how that host works in order to manipulate that host, in order to alter those neurochemical pathways. And so I think this is, again, something that we can think of in terms of thinking about how to interpret our civilizational texts. We do have to take them seriously in a sense. We do have to learn from those texts. We have to understand certain things about how those texts have worked in their own time, and then the history of their transmission across time. We have to have a certain faith in them to learn from them in order then to repurpose them. So this is not, what I'm proposing is not interpretive anarchy. It's not anything says whatever you feel like. You do have to pay attention to the text that you're parasitizing, to use my terms. Then finally, that gets us to the stage of rewiring. The parasite says to the DNA or to the body of the spider, your DNA is fantastic, but it actually doesn't mean what you think it means. It's going to mean something different, and I'm going to take you in a different direction. This, of course, has tragic results if you're an individual spider. But I think, nevertheless, this is an important move that we can make, that we are not, when we are interpreting these, again, these civilizational texts, we are able to say, Homer doesn't mean what you have told me he means, or Plato doesn't mean what he has been said to mean. And in fact, if you simply look at the history of the interpretation of, let's say, Plato, I'm not going to give you a fine, detailed analysis of that, but if you look at the history of the interpretation of Plato, there are 1,000 different Platos. And I think this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this. There are 1,000 different ways of interpreting, all kinds of different things in these Platonic texts. So I think rather than bemoaning that fact, I think we can accept it and actually use that interpretive lability, the interpretive shiftiness in Plato and in all of these texts to say, yes, so let's shift how these texts are seen. All right, so hacking the Greeks is what I am proposing to do, and through this 3-step process of imitation, insertion, imitation, and rewiring. In the larger work, I talk about Homer, I talk about Plato, and I talk about Aristotle. This is just to give you just a little taste of some of the things that I do with those other texts. I'm going to be talking about beastly virtues, so animality and humanity and virtue and excellence in Homer in just a second. In Plato, in various texts, but the Republic and the Timaeus especially, we see vegetarianism proposed quite explicitly as a preferable way of organizing a civilization, of organizing a city. This is in part based on the fact that Plato believes that souls move back and forth between humans and non-humans. So he follows the Pythagoreans and another number of other religious traditions in thinking that souls are immortal and that they move back and forth between humans and non-humans. And then some of his some of the more interesting moments in the Timaeus, he thinks about human beings as kind of aliens or as kind of abducted or fallen aliens on this planet. And there's some really interesting connections with Afrofuturism that I pick up on actually in a talk I'm going to be giving connected with the University of Victoria Department of Political Science. I'm going to be talking about the Afrofuturist aspect of Plato and his kind of alien abduction story. And Aristotle, who in the Politics thinks about a number of non-human animals in his Politics and in his other biological works. He talks about wasps and bees and cranes and a whole bunch of other animals as being political animals. So politics is not even in these foundational Greek texts. Politics is not just a matter of what is human, what is exclusive to human beings. They're in fact quite explicit. Aristotle is quite explicit. Okay, so let me talk a little bit then about the Iliad, and let me think, because I had some larger block quotations that I wanted to kind of walk through to give you more textual evidence, but I think it doesn't make sense given how things have been going with the technology here to try to get too deep into that. So let's just give the overview. The overview is that Homer, this is a text that has Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, but the Iliad is what I focus on, has been taken as one paradigmatic version of what it means to be a human being, what it means to lead a human life, and that is leading a life of distinction in which honor and glory and excellence are really central to what is a human being. There's a whole story about how this is also a little bit of toxic masculinity, what we would call toxic masculinity today. Just hold that in parenthesis for the moment. The basic story that I tell, and I tell it by connecting with the work of Deleuze and Guattari and 1,000 Plateaus, is that what Homer is actually showing us, if you pay attention to the literal words of the text, Homer shows us that the best human, and that's Achilles in his text, Achilles, the kind of hero of the Iliad, the best human being is the most beastly, is the most like a predatory animal. So this is why, and I'm not going to go into the details of the Deleuze and Guattari, but it's a becoming animal. This is what Deleuze and Guattari think about as becoming animal. this is a quotation from Deleuze and Guattari. I'm not going to worry about that. Achilles, this is just one of the most famous sections of the Iliad. It's paralleled by dozens and dozens of other sections in the Iliad where the heroes of the story, whether they're Greeks or whether they're Trojans, are described in their most heroic moments as lions, leopards, dogs, wolves. So what it is to be the best of human beings, and Achilles is seen to be, is depicted in the text as the best of human beings. What it is to be the best human is actually to be the most inhuman, what we might term the most inhuman. And so there were some, truly kind of brutal parts of the text in which Achilles does all kinds of terrible things. He's being likened to a lion who is killing his prey. He actually wants to, so just if you look at the quotation at the bottom of this slide, I wish only that my spirit and fury would drive me to hack your meat away. He's talking to Hector, and he's saying, I'm not going to make any agreements with you to do any nice things, to send your body back to your parents after we fight. I'm not going to do any of the things that supposedly I should do because he's in this moment of just speaking like a lion, what Homer at least thinks of as speaking like a lion. He wants to actually devour Hector. He doesn't actually devour him in the text, but so point for me, just to sort of wrap this part up, Achilles, what seems to be in a sense Achilles at his worst, and this is something that many interpreters of the Iliad shy away from, is they try to say, well, there's some lesson about Achilles learning from his anger and learning to become more mature by not giving into his anger in some way, in a way, by not being as beastly. And I think that has it exactly wrong. I think that the text time and time again shows us that in Homer's view, what it is to be a great human is actually to be a predatory animal. So for me, so just I'm not saying we all need to go out into the streets and act like what Homer thinks a lion acts like. That's not the lesson. So I don't want to be too literal here. But just thinking a little bit more broadly, the point is Homer sees this animality as important to what it is to be human. So the dividing lines between human and non-human, not so firm in Homer. And for me, then, kind of getting to the point of the story, is that Achilles and his animality and his rage is a toolbox or a technology, or what we might term a killer app. It's something that we can actually see in the text, and we can actually pick up on that and use that for ourselves. We can use that to see that the civilizational story about how humans are so fundamentally different from non-humans is not actually there in Homer, and it's not actually there in these other texts that I talk about in the manuscript as a whole. I think Homer actually shows this, and I think maybe he intends this in some sense to show us the power of animality and that the boundaries between human and non-human are not so firm. But in a way, I also think, who cares? In a way, we don't have to be beholden, and this is the parasitic part of my method. We don't have to be beholden to everything that Homer might have thought or intended. We can take this and use it for ourselves. We can use Achilles and use his animality as a path to transformation, a path to transforming our civilization. So I have a long quotation here that I'm not going to spend any time on. It's from a couple of interpreters of Deleuze and Guattari, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. It basically just talks about the way that the process of revolution, that is social and political revolution, is a process of becoming other, is becoming monstrous, giving up your identity that you thought you knew who you were, and altering yourself fundamentally in the process of transforming your society. And this is essentially what I'm talking about. All right, so let me wrap up then. So I think embracing parasitism as a kind of interpretive method moves us away from a politics of purity. So I think it for me, politically, it means that we can engage with ideas and practices that sound on their face to be pretty violent, pretty unwholesome. But I don't think we have to shy away from those unwholesome aspects. I think Achilles and his inhumanity is something to pay attention to and draw from, rather than something to shun and ignore. I think this is a kind of weapon of the weak, this parasitic method and this way of turning these texts around. So Frantz Fanon, I have there, even he talks about, in terms of kind of post-colonial revolutions, talks about thinking of the Algerians who are in France as a kind of infection, a kind of invading parasitic body in France. But this is what you have to do when you are weak and you are trying to alter this large body, this civilization or what have you. You have to insert yourself into larger bodies and then try to hack those, rather than just trying to sort of fight them in some kind of more traditional way. And so I think ultimately what we need to do is not denounce parasitism, but cultivate it as a strategy. Here, just don't pay attention to the little chest burster coming out of the t-shirt there, but posthumanism as the parasite plus the ancients, that is the DNA, versus the Anthropocene as the host. That for me is the kind of key story that's going on here. I have a couple of questions that maybe I'll just put up here because I know I'm running out of time. And I think, I guess I want to say, I put up some questions because I think there are a number, I'm sure you have many, many questions that you would want to throw at me, but, I think there are a number of real issues or, possible problems with this project and this way of proceeding. And I think fairly, you may have a number of these questions or concerns. The first is, am I just suggesting kind of interpretive anarchy? We don't even care what history says. We just sort of make it up. We give up on the idea of truth in interpreting our past. I'm drawing a lot on Foucault and the xenofeminists, so maybe I should be paying a lot more attention to them in this discussion. And I think we could talk about xenofeminists if any of you are so inclined. I'm not giving you a lot of concrete particulars about how changing this civilizational narrative about our civilization actually wins specific political or policy battles in the present, which of course I think is extremely important. And a lot of the work of other scholars at the ASRI is doing exactly that. And I think it's extraordinarily valuable. So, none of what I'm saying here is to say that we shouldn't be doing that more micro work, that more technical work. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done for how to connect these larger civilizational stories to the changes that I want to see in the present. And then finally, you might also just think that parasitism, because of its inherent violence, is just not a particularly good, not inspiring, not ethical, not something that you want to draw on at all. If you're thinking about a kind of more pacific transition, a more peaceful, nonviolent transition away from anthropocentrism. So you might have concerns there. Okay, so I think I will conclude my talk there and would love to hear your questions and comments. So let's see. Yeah, so okay, so I see a hand there from Abigail. Yeah, so I guess what I'll ask is if you'll put a hand up, and then I think I'll see those as they come up here. So let's go with Abigail, and then Josh, and then Luke. So Abigail.
So let's just go with your first. Well, first of all, thank you very much. That's an extremely interesting talk and really engaging set of ideas. My question, and I'm glad that you put up the questions, because you've helped me kind of make my question more coherent, which, let's go with your question number one: is my method betraying historical truth? So I guess one of the reasons that we might be reading the people like Aristotle and Plato today is because we think that their views command some sort of authority. to our views. And I take it, and this is not a challenge, it's more like a exploration. The parasitic method that you're suggesting is precisely letting go of that. And is that, I mean, it's that betraying historical truth. I mean, in one sense, I don't care about truth as much as I care, or I'm curious about the authority that some of these ideas command. And the parasitic method seems to me, and I'm interested to hear you speak about it more, as a method that forgoes the authority of the text or the authority of a historical text and goes for something different, more like a functionalist perspective. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I think so. I think it is challenging, right? I want to challenge in a sense. Maybe my way of saying this is to say I think there's maybe a kind of multi-step process in which I want to recognize the constructed nature of these myths about our past on the one hand, but I also think that we can still sort of allow, so we can allow those myths to still have some place of authority in sort of thinking about our identity, sort of thinking about who we are. I guess it's something like, I'm thinking something analogous to processes in psychoanalysis where you kind of recognize certain, you come to believe certain things about yourself that are kind of constructed, but you also still try to behave as if they're true in some sense. So you're kind of a little bit at a distance from them. And so that's why it's not, they don't have authority. I think you're right. They don't have authority in the sense of being absolutely unquestioned, but they are still, you can still sort of play with them, but there is a slight, there is a slight remove from it where there's a little bit of play while also still believing that they can have some kind of efficacy and some kind of truth, but in a way it's a little bit more of a kind of chosen truth. In the way, and I don't want to cite the Capitol riot as precedent in any real positive way, but I just think it's illustrative that there's a way in which the cosplay, the playing with the past and the pretending that this is 1776 and all that, that it does actually have some efficacy, even while I think people recognize that they're doing some cosplay. But it's true that I think it's not the same as, the authority of a burning bush speaking to us or something, something like that. But thanks. And I think I need to think a little bit more about how those, what I'm calling moments, kind of play with each other or interact with each other.
I know that there are 3 other people whose hands are up, but just for clarification, so the concern is that, what I hear you say, and it might be wrong, but something like a touchstone, right? So that you want these kind of figures or events, so to be a touchstone for contemporary purposes, but the more they have authority, the more it matters. It seems to me that we get them right. And so the more it can't be anachronistic, and it can't be, it can be anachronistic. It can't be, it can't be whatever we want it to be. It can't be that Plato said a million different things in a million different ways. It has to be anchored. It just seems to me, and I agree with taking these ideas and using them. And I think it's very intriguing what you say about using them in that way. But the concern again is that the more authority that they're going to have, the more then it's going to matter what the truth is.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of fine line I see there.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I think I'm seeing in part, I guess I want to separate these what I'm calling moments as being what sort of theorists might do versus how these might operate as political myths out in the world. And so they might be more believed and be more authoritative out there in the world. Okay, but no, thank you. Okay, so Josh, I think I want to say that you were the second hand that I saw, so please.
Great talk. So I guess I originally had a question about coercion, but I want to bite on the xenofeminist stuff in the sense that I think that there's definitely, when you made the point that in the third question, how concretely does changing the narrative, win political battles in the present? I think going to the xenofeminist stuff might be at least some way to, at least hit at some of those potential questions, because there is, at least within, some of the language, the idea of, fully automated luxury communist gender proliferation, and letting hundreds of sexes bloom in some respects, sees at least there's some sort of, element of praxis that exists within, the writing of the xenofeminists that might be able to, push you into at least other creative sort of venues beyond that sort of thing. But I guess I'm wondering, because it seems like xenofeminists, along with some of the left, are trying to also retcon aspects of accelerationism, which is, not surprisingly getting a lot of, pushback lately. So I wonder, is that something that, in your creative reading, when you say, let's just throw this to the side for now, is this something that you're perhaps worried about with picking up someone like the xenofeminist, that, this strategy of acceleration might be too, laden with its own past? Or is that something that you could fruitfully work through?
Yeah, that's interesting. I find I guess I find a fair bit of inspiration in what the xenofeminists are doing with trying to pick up on and radicalize these accelerationist themes. And I'm not troubled, in part because I'm working at a different level. Not at a higher level, but I'm just because some of the questions that I've been working on have not been looking at those more specific implications, maybe that that you're raising, the sort of troubling aspects of accelerationist thought. But I think, look, I think in the, just to get fictional again for a second, in some of the quite radical species alterations that we see in the science fiction of Octavia Butler, and then in the fiction that Donna Haraway is doing, as part of her theorizing in Staying with the Trouble, that's looking at really radically reconstituting human biology in the service of reconstituting human society in a way that is not just sustainable, but that is much more deeply ecological. But it means taking up these alterations in a much more serious way with ourselves, becoming other to ourselves, really concretely in our biology. I think there are all kinds of things that are possibly troubling about that, but as a way into the future, I think these are probably perhaps right and necessary. And so I guess I'm not, because of the damage that we are doing is so severe to what we think of as ourselves, but then also to all of the rest of life on Earth. I'm much less troubled by those kinds of things. So okay, so thanks, Josh. And then I think Luke, I want to say you were next in line.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was kind of sort of build off Abigail's central question of the need to get it right, why it matters. Because as you kind of hinted at towards the end, within parasitism, or the kind of hermeneutics of this method of reading, there is a an urge to as you acknowledge, the insertion in itself is sort of can be a colonizing sort of, as much as we can rewrite and reinscribe the text and the figures we're looking into, there's an equal tendency towards colonizing them. And the question I have is, how do we know the parasitic reading we're doing or you're doing is the right one and will lead to the right effects and will not in turn be parasitically read in the wrong way? I'm intrigued if you've kind of not necessarily thought, it's not like a feedback mechanism, but how do we know we're getting it right? And how do we know that others will read us in the right way and our parasitic readings? How would you, maybe that's not the point, but I think there is a danger that can result from someone reappropriating our readings and so on. So
yeah, that's great question and valid concerns. Not that you need me to validate you, but I mean, I think, I have a number of important, I don't know that I would call them foundations, but touchstones about how I think we are closer to getting it right, which is thinking more seriously in the way that, let's say, the thought, and in the larger work I talk, I'm in dialogue with work of Bruno Latour and others who are thinking about how to take seriously the matter of constructing a commons in which we have humans and non-humans trying to speak in a sense to one another and think about representing each other. So for me, I mean, I have some general principles, but I wouldn't call them foundations, but general principles about always asking ourselves if we are, if we are actually addressing other beings in the world, in a sense, in their own, through their own eyes, if we are at least trying to see how things look with the beings that we are dealing with and upon whom we are having effects, if we actually are trying to also for ourselves represent how the world appears to them and what appears to be right for them. Now that doesn't finalize how to settle all kinds of matters of relationship between different species, but it's a kind of basic underlying principle or to the practice. But I do think that there's no way to avoid the danger and the violence of interpretation and kind of parasitism, because I think that in a way we are always already doing these things. I don't mean to say that parasitism as a method of interpreting texts is some kind of Derridian, undeconstructible aspect that we always must do this. I mean, I'm not making any ontological claims, but just as a matter of kind of historical fidelity, I think we can see across time that this is a tendency in all sorts of cultures, across thousands of years, that we have these shifting interpretations because the people who are doing the interpreting are always interpreting whatever they're interpreting, through this complicated dance of what they take themselves to be wanting, and then the things that they then find in these texts, and how they interpret those. And so I think there is something that is kind of parasitic in pretty much all interpretive moves. And I don't think that there is any final way of saying, what the one right way is, and that we have, I think we have to allow that future generations and future interpreters will in turn parasitize us, and that's unavoidable. And I hope that parasitism can be, in service of a kind of interspecies civilization that is less damaging to the planet, but But I think there's no way of avoiding that sort of danger. But that may be an unsatisfying answer, I recognize. So thank you though. So I think there was Mara and then Jordan, and I think we have about 11 minutes. So just to say, I think how much time we have at the moment. So yeah, Mara.
Hi, Stefan. Great talk. I have a couple of comments and just to explain where I come from, and also a question both about or some sets of questions or comments about parasitism as a method and how I see also this conversation with Abigail and Luke, and about substance. But let me start with the substance. So your interpretation of Achilles and kind of that. So I take it that the method allows you to do a certain reading of these texts that is supposed to show us a non-anthropocentric view of non-human life. And I'm sure there is more to be said, but on the particular example that you gave about Achilles' kind of war virtue being modeled on animals, it just seems to me that that is just not a very good example, because the image, what counts there seems to me is that the image of the animal that is being used is very familiar and very much the anthropocentric, and meaning that everything that is kind of brutal and cannot be and non-rational is placed on the animal, and there is a contrast there between kind of this brutal warlike. So the animal that is used there is more to show what Achilles is special, why he's good in war or something. So that is just didn't live up to me, to the promise of the method. Now the method, I think I disagree with these concerns about getting the classics right. I think there is a debate and an ongoing debate about what they mean, and we always come with our own questions that come out of our own world. So it's not really about getting Plato right, but about getting Plato maybe to work for us. But actually, I think, so I have two thoughts about the parasitism, actually, as opposed to explaining kind of what the method is in other ways. One is that by making it about parasites, you actually do, or the idea itself of parasites, one could argue that there admits a distinction between kind of the real authentic animal, the main animal on whose body or on whose functions a parasite, so different purposes. So you kind of agree on this distinction. So one, you could even, I thought you would say what you said actually, that actually we do all the time this thing, but then it's not clear that the idea of parasites, of like the real interpretation versus interpretation for our own purposes, as it were, makes sense. But talking in terms of parasites actually kind of keeps a distinction between, as it were, interpretation for the purposes that are in the work or in the period or in the historical period versus the interpretation of our own interests. At the same time, and this may pull in a different direction, what I like about the idea is that the metaphor itself is biological. So that you use a metaphor from the biological realm, and maybe you can even say something about how we think usually about biology or about the living world as if there are independent species that live independently and parasites are these weird things, as opposed to thinking of parasites as kind of central and everybody depending on everybody. I mean, if you take parasitism as kind of central, then in some way can say something about even this idea that we have separate interests or separate aims and purposes, and there is it makes sense in a certain way to make sense. But I just like the idea that it's biological, but it's also like not necessarily usually central to how we think of biology, and that it's about living together, as it were. Because actually a lot of parasites is not only them, the host also needs them. So that makes me think. I'll shut up now.
Yeah, great. So I think just for time, so thank you. And I think for time sense, I will go to Jordan. I'll just say you're wrong about Achilles, but but I won't tell you why. But no, thank you. And the distinction, whether I should be maintaining this distinction, well, I'm going to have to talk to you more about that. That's an interesting thought. Okay, so thank you. And Jordan, I think you're going to be, you get to be the last questioner.
Great, thanks so much, Stefan, and thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I just, as I was going through it, I noticed, of course, you pick some major players in terms of Homer and Plato and Aristotle, but I'm wondering, I guess there's some lesser known, I guess, characters such as perhaps Theophrastus, Aristotle's disciple, who does advocate for, you know, the, I guess, not, I don't want to say for veganism, but just for essentially for people to treat animals well, to not be violent towards animals from a strong ethical standpoint, and I think away from the transferal of souls from between human and non-human bodies and such, or someone like Epimetheus, who, you know, is Prometheus's brother, and who basically, you know, gives animals all their colors and fur and abilities, and doesn't have enough left for humanity at the end. You know, there seems to be some body of text that does speak to an alternative non-anthropocentric sort of consideration that just doesn't really get the attention. And I don't know if part of it's confirmation bias, in a way that we always go back to the stories and characters who kind of affirm our position of superiority or power. But it seems that I guess one part of my question is, you know, did you consider those types of characters in your research and in this? And I guess the other piece is, have you considered kind of a Nietzschean perspective that, you know, looks at, you know, Plato and Socrates, and sees this really as the beginning of what he would look at as the trajectory of, like, rationalism and a condemnation of nature, kind of a hate for the vitality of instinct or the experience of life in that context, and away from instinct and away from animality, which you're talking about here, and of course introduces it in an entirely new way in his work based on those same Greek principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. Thank you. I'll start. I think I only have 2 minutes. So with the Nietzsche first. So that was initially the way I approached the Greeks, was through a much more purely critical lens of thinking that they had started us off on the wrong road, and that I wanted to challenge them. And going to them, I just found much more that was actually familiar, or not familiar, but it was much more kind of friendly to some of the perspectives that I've, you know, brought to the texts. So I began to think that, in fact, it would be more interesting to try to, you know, repurpose the Greeks, or to draw out these strands that have been ignored for a long time, rather than take this kind of more critical approach. I think obviously it's true that Nietzsche, and actually the Deleuze, you know, I was talking through Deleuze and Guattari, and of course they're critical of a certain kind of Platonism, which is, I think, also picking up on some of the influence of Nietzsche on Deleuze and Guattari. So, you know, I think that's there, but I think to me, it's more interesting and maybe more valuable to radicalize the Greeks rather than to oppose them. And I'll just say, yes, I love a number of other lesser known Greek thinkers, Theophrastus, Porphyry, Plutarch. I have them in footnotes for the work as a whole, because they've kind of dropped out of the story about Western civilization, at least as being kind of part of our canonical civilizational DNA. That's why I'm not focusing as much on them, but they are absolutely crucial to how I understand what's going on in Plato. And in fact, one of the things that I bring up in the text is that so Plutarch and Porphyry and other Neoplatonists have this view of Plato as, as believing that souls migrate back and forth between humans and non-humans, and they have this vegetarian, if not necessarily vegan, way of seeing Plato. And that was historically, for several hundred years, that was the primary way of understanding Plato. Who Plato was as thought through the Neoplatonists. So the idea now that we think that it's crazy to think about Plato, for instance, as having all of these affective, connectivities with non-human beings, that was actually the majoritarian, the kind of the dogmatic position for hundreds of years in late antiquity. So that's absolutely something that I mobilize in making some of the arguments in the text. But I think I'm now at the point where the moderator needs to come in and cut us off, or take us out. Am I correct about that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Stefan. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I'm Holly Sissel, the project coordinator with the Animals in Society Research Initiative here at the University of Victoria. And we just so appreciate, Stefan, your fascinating lecture, and also the PDF that you sent out in advance. So much to chew through in that. This video will also be posted to the Animals in Society Research Initiative website under the media gallery. So if you know anyone who missed it, they can view that here. So our next lecture in the Distinguished Lecture Series will be welcoming Professor Lynn Jackson from King's University College at the University of Western Ontario, Department of Psychology, and she'll be speaking on February 16th. Her title is Running with Horses, Reflections on the Psychology of Speciesism. So you can pre-register for that lecture on the ASRI website as well. So we'll sign off. Thank you again to Taylor for hosting at the beginning, and to Stefan Dolgert. Wish that we could be with you in person more here in Victoria, since you came all this way out, but online we've been able to have about 35 people connecting across North America and Europe today. So thank you so much for all of your great work.
Thank you.